Debating over Messi and Maradona's World Cup performance is now one of the most talked about things within the football community. And while that conversation can be very complex and extremely interesting, there is just only one problem. That version of Messi wasn't the Argentinian's prime. So today, we will be going back to a time when Messi was infinitely more powerful, by comparing his 2014 World Cup campaign to Maradona's legendary run in '86, to find out once and for all who was more impressive in the most admired competition in the world. Before we go into the details of this debate, it's important to understand the settings behind all of the games that each player had to play in order to accurately understand how difficult it was for both Messi and Maradona to perform. Seeing that the FIFA World Ranking website doesn't go beyond the year 1992, in order to obtain the rankings of the teams Maradona had to go up against, we will be using the World Football ELO ranking system, a website with an extremely reliable formula that was later modified to create the official FIFA ranking system that most people are familiar with. According to this website, over the span of the entire tournament, Messi's Argentina faced harder opponents on average in each round, when Maradona's Argentina does have the edge if you were to take the average of all of his opponents' rating. So to remain relatively objective and come to a definite conclusion on who faced harder opponents, I looked over who faced more people that played within the top 5 leagues on each team. And after looking over all of these players' information, unlike in 2022, Messi's 2014 Argentina definitely played more players that played within the top 5 leagues, meaning he most likely had a harder time if we were to compare him to Maradona. Now, I know most Maradona fans will say that football back then was much more aggressive and dangerous compared to now, and that is true. But I could easily make the argument that what modern players lack in aggression, they make up for in tactics and organization. So the game is more or less the same in terms of difficulty. The next obvious part of this puzzle is to find out who had better support on their team to deal with their opposition. And if we use the same method as before, Messi's Argentina does have more players that played within the top 5 leagues, and it's not really close. However, seeing that there are great players on Maradona's team like Sergio Batista and other greats that didn't play within the top 5 leagues in that year specifically, the only real way to find the answer to this question is to analyze how their team performed collectively during these tournaments. From a casual fan's point of view, one can easily point out the fact that while both teams started the tournament really strong, Messi's Argentina slowly started to struggle the more they advanced and the harder the opposition became, when Maradona's team was able to maintain a consistent level of play regardless of the opposition. And while this is true, it is a very simplistic way of explaining a very complex story. If we look at a detailed analysis of how both teams performed over 5 games in their respective tournaments, Messi's team did play better when it comes to successful passes, possession percentage, and sum of player events, stats that had to do with the team attempting to take control of the game. However, Maradona's team was much better when it comes to really going at their opponent, because they weren't just taking more shots at goal, they were doing so in higher XG positions on average when compared to their future counterpart, meaning they were consistently shooting from where they had a better chance to score. This lack of forward mobility, which was probably the result of Messi's questionable midfield and at times attackers, is why I can confidently say for a fact, Messi was not just playing against harder opponents, he had to do so with a more uncoordinated cast around him. So with that out of the way, which one of these two players were more impressive when analyzing them from the eye test? Well, this is going to be the most interesting part about this comparison. In this section, we will be looking at who was better based on shooting, dribbling, passing, and their overall impact on their team to determine who was actually better to look at when playing. When it comes to shooting, Maradona scored more goals than Messi over the span of the entire tournament. The overall quality of his goals wasn't just godly, they are some of the most famous goals in the history of the game. For example, his legendary run against England and the infamous Hand of God. But this is really close, seeing that Messi's goals were extremely difficult to score, both in the technique and the situations that he found himself in. For instance, from all of the goals that both players scored from their respective World Cup, without considering the build-up play or the dribbles that led each player to have a shot, Messi's goals were more difficult to score. For example, his goal against Iran in the 90+ minute is the most difficult shot to score, having only a 2.4% chance of scoring. And his free kick against Nigeria from 26 meters out was the second hardest, having only a 6.1% chance of scoring. For context, the most difficult shot scored by Maradona in the 1986 World Cup was his goal against Italy, a goal that had an 8.7% chance of scoring. It is really difficult to pick a winner here, but if I had to, I would go with Maradona. Although Messi's goals were better if we are talking about just the technique or the beauty of the finish itself, what tipped the scale in Maradona's favor here is that from the games that was analyzed, Messi was the one that was more wasteful with the chances that he gets, when Maradona actually outperformed his XG, scoring when he really wasn't supposed to. So this is just 1 point for Maradona. For dribbling, this is where most modern fans would say that there is no way Maradona was dribbling better than an informed Messi, because in the last 20 years, there is no one that was more feared in a 1v1 situation. And while I can't say for sure that Maradona was dribbling on the same level as Messi domestically, he was for sure dribbling on the same level as Messi in the World Cup without much difficulty at all. With an average of 7.6 and 6.6 successful dribbles in every single game, we are talking about some god tier stuff here. And for those who can't understand or even picture these numbers, let me break it down for you. From all the players that made it to the final of the World Cup, playing as a second striker and as an attacking midfielder, there is not a single player since the 1970 World Cup that was able to have more successful dribbles when compared to Messi and Maradona. They are really in a class by themselves. The only other player that's a standard here is one of my favorite players of all time, the great Johan Cruyff. So if you were lucky enough to watch Messi live during the 2014 World Cup, in terms of dribbling, you were watching something that only ever happens probably every 50 years. And if you were one of the few people that had the pleasure of watching Maradona basically walk on water in the 1986 World Cup, well, I'm sorry to say, but in terms of dribbling on the highest level, you have seen it all. So just like with shooting, Messi's numbers and dribbling aesthetics is really close to Maradona's. But Diego honestly made it his priority to run at every single player that was on his opponent's team. And knowing him, he was probably smack talking while doing so too. So this is just another point for Diego. When it comes to passing, as I explained in the other Messi and Maradona World Cup video, Messi's passing is one of his greatest talents that is sometimes overlooked because of how good he is at scoring and dribbling the ball. And this is just another excellent case study to show just how important passing is to his game. At a glance, because Maradona has more chances created with the same overall passing accuracy, you might think that his passing was just better in contrast to Messi. But that's far from the truth. If we are talking about just numbers here, Messi wasn't just making more passes on average when compared to Maradona, he was simply far more accurate in almost every single metric. And this goes far beyond just numbers as well. When Messi is about to pass a ball, his execution is normally spot on. The accuracy of even some of his most audacious attempts is usually on point, and his player animation is extremely satisfying to the eye. Although Maradona is pretty accurate, unlike his dribbling aesthetics, his passing animation isn't that impressive. So the winner here is Messi. And finally, when it comes to who was more of a net positive for their team, believe it or not, there is a really strong case here to be made for Messi. If we are talking about their goal contribution output alone, Maradona does have 5 more goals to his name when compared to Messi. However, if we take a second to exclude the final product of their hard work, Messi was the one that was more of a net positive when looking at how precise he was at everything that he was doing. When Messi passes the ball, his accuracy is on par if not better than Maradona's. When he shoots, he pulls off the impossible, and when he dribbles, he was more likely to get past you when compared to Maradona. Although his chances created per game isn't as high as Diego's, one could easily make the argument that it wasn't Messi that was failing to create for the team. It was his team that wasn't as effective at working around his genius. This is also the conclusion that the team at Opta arrived to as well. Going back to the previous article, even when you look at their positive ball movement points, which is just a system that awards numbers to players' dribbles and passes per 90 based on the danger levels it poses to the opposition, Maradona does have more positive movement points from the 5 games that was analyzed. However, because Maradona wasn't as precise as Messi when playing, mainly when passing and dribbling, his net ball movement points were lower than Messi, meaning if you had to choose, picking a 2014 Messi over a 1986 Maradona isn't as insane as it sounds if we are not talking about goals and assists. So with all that being said here, what's the overall conclusion? Well, if we are talking about whose World Cup performance was overall better, Maradona is the one that's the winner here. Not only was his performance godly, he was able to outperform his XG, which makes his World Cup performance for me the most impressive that I've ever seen, both on paper in terms of stats and on recording, seeing that I was able to rewatch all of his games from this tournament. And from the perspective of the eye test, I suspect that a lot of people would pick Maradona, and this is mainly due to him dribbling as much as he was. However, if we are talking about who is a better pick to go on your team, who would be more precise with almost everything that they do and would consistently choose the best choice when faced with an obstacle on average, I think Messi is your guy, and I don't think this should be surprising to anyone at all. When I would say that modern players are better than older players, people tend to think that I'm implying that older players would struggle in the modern game, when that's not necessarily what I'm saying at all. Football is no longer just about winning. It's about playing efficiently. What makes Messi objectively better than Maradona is that he do things just that 1% better. For example, before the 2000s, players that had a 50% chance at success when running at their opponents would be allowed to do whatever they wanted. But now, only players that can consistently dribble at 60% is allowed to. And this is the same thing that is happening with everything else in the modern version of the game. And believe me when I say that this evolution of highly efficient players won't just end with Messi. So yeah, I hope this video was insightful for you guys. I know a lot of fans and pundits like to dismiss Messi's 2014 World Cup performance like it was an absolute failure on Messi's part, when in all honesty, it was probably the most that one man could do in a team sport. So this video was mainly to explain why that's the case. If you guys want to look at the full article that was used for this video, the link will be in the description. And as always, thanks for watching.